My name is Eleanor, and I'm 31 years old. 5 years ago, my mother called me 3 days before Thanksgiving and said 4 words that shattered everything. I thought I knew about family, love, and belonging. There isn't a seat. That was it. No preamble. No, I'm so sorry to tell you this. Just a flat, factual statement delivered with the same clinical indifference she used to tell the dry cleaner he'd missed a spot on her favorite silk blouse. I remember exactly where I was. I was in my studio, the scent of eucalyptus and turpentine hanging heavy in the air. I'm a floral illustrator. I spend my days trying to capture the delicate, fleeting beauty of things that are destined to wither. I had my phone tucked between my ear and my shoulder, my hand stained with a deep bruised indigo pigment. I was looking at a sketch of a peony, thinking about how the petals looked like they were shielding a secret heart. "What do you mean, Mom?" I asked. My voice sounded small, even to me. I hated that. I hated how, the moment she spoke, I regressed from a grown woman with a mortgage and a career back into a 10-year-old girl hoping for a gold star. "Victoria's new in-laws are coming," she said. I could hear the clink of ice against glass on her, and her afternoon gin and tonic. And since they're bringing the twins, and James's brother is coming up from the city, the dining room is just full. We're at capacity, Eleanor. You understand. It's a logistics issue. A logistics issue, like I was a shipment of freight that couldn't be squeezed into the warehouse. "I can bring a folding chair," I said. My throat felt tight, like I'd swallowed a handful of dry sand. "I can sit at the kitchen island." "I don't even need a place setting, Mom. I just want to be there." There was a long, pointed silence. The kind of silence my mother used as a weapon, a cold, suffocating blanket, designed to let you know exactly how much of a burden your existence was. "Don't be dramatic," she sighed. "It's just one dinner. We'll do something together in December. Maybe. Besides, you're so busy with your little drawings. I'm sure you could use the extra time to catch up on work. Victoria says you've been looking a bit tired lately." Victoria, the golden child, the sister whose life was a series of curated, high-definition triumphs. Her wedding had cost more than my college tuition. Her pregnancy announcement had involved a professional film crew. And now her in-laws were the priority. They were the real family. I was the leftover. I was the acceptable sacrifice. "Does Dad know?" I asked. I heard a muffled sound in the background, the distant, rhythmic thud of a wood splitter. The line went dead. I sat there for a long time, the cold plastic of the phone still pressed against my ear. Outside, the November rain began to lash against the window pane of my studio. A rhythmic, lonely sound. The radiator clanked and hissed, but the room felt freezing. I looked down at my drawing. The indigo ink had ruined it. The delicate petals were stained, the symmetry destroyed. I had spent hours on that piece, trying to get the light just right, trying to show how something fragile could still be strong. And in 10 seconds, it was gone. I didn't cry, not then. I was too well trained for that. In my house, crying was making a scene. Crying was attention-seeking. I stood up and walked to the window. Across the street, my neighbor was dragging a large, plastic-wrapped turkey from his trunk. His young daughter was skipping beside him, clutching a bag of cranberries like it was a treasure. They were laughing. The interior light of their house was a warm, buttery yellow. I realized then that I wasn't just missing a dinner. I was missing a foundation. I was 30 years old, and I was still waiting for someone to pull out a chair for me. I was still waiting to be the person who couldn't be missed. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. I looked pale, my eyes shadowed by the dim light. I looked like a ghost in my own life. I walked over to the trash can and dropped the ruined peony drawing inside. Then I picked up my coat. I couldn't stay in the studio. The silence was too loud. It was the sound of 30 years of being the extra person. The one who sat at the card table. The one who took the photos so she didn't have to be in them. The one who stayed behind so everyone else could move forward. Something inside me went quiet. Not sad, not angry, just empty. But as the darkness settled in, something else settled too, a quiet decision I didn't even fully understand yet. If there wasn't a seat for me at their table, I was going to stop trying to bring my own chair. My father was outside. He was always outside when the hard conversations happened. He was a man of quiet kindness and devastating passivity. He loved me, I knew that in the way you know the sun is behind a thick layer of clouds. You can't see the light, but you know it's technically there. But he never fought for me. He never looked at my mother and said, "Our daughter is coming home. Make room. He agrees it's for the best, she lied. Or maybe she wasn't lying. Maybe he did agree, simply because agreeing was easier than the alternative. Right, I whispered. My hand was shaking. A drop of indigo ink fell from my brush and hit the paper, blooming like a dark, ugly bruise right in the center of my peony. Okay, have a nice dinner, Mom. Don't be like that, Eleanor. We'll talk soon. The decision didn't just happen that night in the studio. It was the final grain of sand that caused the dune to collapse, the end of a long, quiet erosion that had been happening since I was old enough to notice the weight of a gaze or the lack of one. I spent that evening walking. The air smelled of wet pavement and the first sharp hint of a freeze. My boots clicked hollowly against the sidewalk, a solitary rhythm in a neighborhood that was humming with the frantic energy of holiday preparation. People were hauling crates of wine into their foyers. I could hear the muffled, joyous bray of a television from a basement window. Every sound felt like a bruise. I found myself thinking about the summer I turned 7. We were at the lake house, the one my mother's family had owned for generations. Victoria was 9, a whirlwind of blonde curls and effortless charm. She had learned to dive that summer, a perfect gleaming arc into the water that made my father cheer, so loud the birds scattered from the pines. I remember standing on the edge of that same splintered wooden dock, my knees knobby and shaking, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wanted that cheer. I wanted that look of uncomplicated pride in my father's eyes. Watch me, I had shouted, my voice cracking. My father had looked over, his hand already reaching for a towel to wrap around a shivering, triumphant Victoria. In a second, Elle. Let me just get your sister dried off. I waited. I stood there until the sun dipped below the tree line and the water turned from blue to a dark, intimidating iron. I stood there until the mosquitoes began to bite and the smell of charcoal smoke drifted down from the porch. He never looked back. When they walked up to the house, their shadows long and joined together, they didn't even notice I was still standing on the edge of the dark. I eventually walked up by myself, the wood cold under my bare feet. When I walked into the kitchen, my mother was ruffling Victoria's damp hair. There she is, my mother said, not looking at me but at the clock. Go wash up, Eleanor. You're late for dinner, and I won't have the table disrupted. That was the pattern. Victoria was the event. I was the disruption. Victoria was the headline. I was the fine print. I stopped walking and leaned against a cold iron fence. My hands were shoved deep into my pockets, my fingers tracing the jagged edge of a house key. I realized then that my entire life had been a series of logistics issues. When I won the regional art scholarship in high school, the ceremony overlapped with Victoria's cheerleading banquet. My parents went to the banquet. She's the captain. Eleanor, my mother had explained while she helped Victoria pin a bow into her hair. It's a leadership role. Your art. Well, you'll have other galleries, won't you? Just take pictures for us? I thought about my father. I could almost see him now, sitting in his leather chair in the den, staring at the fireplace while my mother organized the silver. He would be nursing a scotch, his eyes fixed on the flames, carefully avoiding the empty space where his youngest daughter should have been. His silence wasn't peace. It was a white flag. He had surrendered me to my mother's coldness decades ago just to keep the house quiet. I'm done, I whispered to the empty street. The words didn't feel heavy. They felt light. They felt like oxygen. I turned around and headed back toward my apartment. The emptiness I'd felt in the studio was beginning to change. It was sharpening into something else, a cold, clear clarity. For years, I had been the one holding the rope in a game of tug-of-war, where the other side wasn't even pulling. They had just dropped their end and walked away, leaving me straining against nothing, exhausted and bruised. I went home and made a cup of bitter coffee. I sat in my living room, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. My apartment was filled with things I loved: dried botanical pressings, velvet pillows in shades of moss and gold, books with broken spines. It was a beautiful life, but it was a life built in the margins of someone else's story. I pulled out my phone. I went to the group chat, the one with my mother, father, and Victoria. I saw a photo Victoria had just posted. It was a picture of a centerpiece she'd bought, a sprawling, expensive arrangement of dried wheat and white pumpkins. Testing out the tablescape for Thursday? So excited for the full house. My mother had loved the photo. My father hadn't responded. I started to type. My thumbs hovered over the glass. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them how much it hurt. I wanted to remind them of the lake house, the scholarship, the cold turkey left on the counter for me while they ate dessert in the other room. But I didn't. Instead, I did something much harder. I exited the chat. I went to my settings and I hit leave conversation. Then I went to my mother's contact. I looked at her name, Mom, a word that should mean safety, a word that should mean home. I hit block. I did the same for Victoria. When I got to my father, my thumb hesitated. I remembered him slipping me a $20 bill when I went to college, whispering, "Buy yourself something pretty, L," before looking over his shoulder to see if my mother was watching. It was the most he'd ever done. It wasn't enough. I blocked him too. I sat in my apartment as the sun went down, watching the shadows stretch across my floor. My father had a chance to choose me, and he chose silence instead. I was officially alone, 3 days before the biggest family holiday of the year. And for the first time in my life, the silence didn't feel like a punishment. But as the night deepened, the reality of what I'd just done began to sink in. I was 31 years old, and I had no one. I had sat in that high school auditorium alone, clutching a certificate that felt like a mockery. I didn't take pictures. As I stood there in the rain, 3 days before Thanksgiving, the memories felt like physical weights. I thought about the phone call again. There isn't a seat. It wasn't just about a chair. It was about the fact that in their world, I was a ghost that only became visible when I was needed to fill a gap or play a role. The silence of a blocked phone is different from the silence of a missed call. One is a void. The other is a fortress. By Thanksgiving morning, the fortress felt more like a tomb. I woke up to a gray, bruised sky and the sound of sleet tapping against my bedroom window. A cold, rhythmic metallic scratching that mirrored the anxiety in my chest. Usually, on this morning, I would be halfway through a frantic 3-hour drive, gripping the steering wheel and rehearsing my neutral face, so I wouldn't upset my mother or upstage Victoria. Now I was just in bed. The smell of the apartment was stagnant. No roasting turkey, no sage, no buttery steam rising from a stovetop. Just the faint floral scent of my laundry detergent and the cold, sharp smell of the sleet. I stayed under the covers until 11 a.m., watching the light shift from a dull pewter to a sickly yellow. I kept reaching for my phone, a ghost limb reflex, wanting to see if the wall I'd built was holding. I wanted to see if they had tried to reach me. I wanted to see if my father had finally stood up in the middle of the living room, looked at the crowded table, and asked, "Where is my daughter?" But the screen stayed black. Even if they were screaming into the void wasn't reporting back. By 2 p.m., the loneliness shifted from a dull ache to a physical weight on my lungs. I tried to distract myself. I pulled out a fresh sheet of cold-pressed paper and my watercolors. I tried to paint a sprig of bittersweet, the orange berries that burst open in the cold, but my hand was shaking. I couldn't find the light. Every stroke looked muddy, tired, and small. I looked at my kitchen. I had a carton of eggs, a half-used block of sharp cheddar, and some wilted spinach. That was my Thanksgiving. The weight of being unchosen is a heavy thing to carry into a holiday. It's the feeling of being the only person in the world who isn't. Behind a warm window, I imagined them, my mother in her pearl earrings, Victoria laughing at something her brother-in-law said, the twins spilling juice on the white linen I wasn't allowed to sit at. I could almost taste the gravy, the tartness of the cranberry sauce, the sweetness of the pumpkin pie. I felt like a stray dog looking through the glass at a feast. "Stop it," I whispered to the empty room. My voice sounded cracked. I stood up, my joints feeling stiff and old. I couldn't stay here. The walls were closing in, covered in the sketches of all the things I'd tried to use to fill the holes in my heart. I needed noise. I needed the smell of something other than my own isolation. I put on my heaviest wool coat, the one in a deep forest green that my mother always said made me look sallow. I wrapped a thick scarf around my neck until only my eyes were visible. I didn't even brush my hair. I just shoved it under a beanie and grabbed my keys. I drove. I parked the car, my breath coming in short white puffs. I stood on the sidewalk for a long minute, my hand on the cold brass handle of the door. I almost turned back. I looked like a mess. My eyes were red from a nap that was actually a bout of despair. And I was a stranger. But the smell hit me then. It wasn't just turkey. It was something deeper. Roast garlic, rosemary, red wine, and the unmistakable sweet scent of baking bread. It smelled like the childhood I had imagined, but never actually lived. I pushed the door open. A small bell chimed. The warmth hit my face like a physical embrace. The room was packed, but not with the curated, polished people I was used to. There were couples in flannel, a group of students who looked like they'd stayed on campus, and an elderly man in a suit that was 20 years out of style. It was loud. It was messy. It was alive. A woman with silver, hair pulled back in a messy bun, and a flour-dusted apron looked up from a large tureen of soup. She didn't look at my messy hair or my red eyes with judgment. She looked at me with a sharp, piercing kind of clarity, as if she could see the logistics issue written across my forehead. "You're late," she said, her voice warm and raspy, like a cello. "But the stuffing is still hot." She didn't ask if I had a reservation. She didn't ask who I was with. She just wiped her hands on her apron and gestured to a small, wooden table near the back, right next to a crackling fireplace. I'm alone," I stammered. She smiled, and for the first time in years, I felt the tension in my shoulders drop an inch. "Not in here, you aren't. I'm Eleanor." I blinked. "I'm ISO Eleanor." She laughed, a rich, belly-deep sound. "Well then, Eleanor, it's a lucky day. Sit down, I'll bring the wine." I grabbed my coat. If I was going to eat Thanksgiving dinner alone, I was going to do it somewhere with actual food, with light, with life. I just had to find a restaurant that was still open. I didn't know it yet, but as I sat down at that small, wobbly table, I wasn't just sitting down for a meal. I was sitting down for the rest of my life. Most of the streets were ghost town empty. Every house I passed had a glow in the windows, the flickering blue of a football game or the warm amber of a chandelier. It felt like the whole world was in a secret club, and I'd been kicked out for the crime of wanting to belong. I ended up downtown, near the old brick district. I was looking for anything: a diner, a dive bar, a late-night cafe. Most of the closed-for-holiday signs felt like personal rejections. Then I saw it. On a corner of a cobblestone street, tucked between a closed bookstore and an empty gallery, was a small bistro called The Hearth. The windows were steamed up, glowing with a soft, inviting gold. A chalkboard stood outside, partially covered in sleet. "Today's menu, whatever we have left. Everyone is welcome. No one eats alone." My heart did a strange, painful little stutter. The bistro felt less like a business and more like a living. Breathing lung, inhaling the cold and exhaling a golden, rosemary-scented warmth. As I sat at the small table near the fire, the heat began to thaw the literal and figurative ice that had settled in my marrow. I looked around. To my left, a young man was reading a worn paperback while eating mashed potatoes. To my right, an older couple was sharing a single slice of pie, whispering to each other with the kind of shorthand that only decades of marriage can forge. No one was performing. No one was checking their reflection in the back of a spoon. The silver-haired Eleanor returned, carrying a glass of deep, garnet-colored red wine and a basket of bread that was still steaming, its crust dusted with sea salt. "Drink," she commanded gently, setting the glass down. "You look like you've been holding your breath for about 3 years." I took a sip. It was earthy and bold, hitting the back of my throat with a heat that made my eyes prickle. "Thank you," I whispered. I didn't think anywhere would be open. I thought I'd be spending the night with a block of cheddar and my own thoughts. She pulled out the chair, opposite me, a move that would have been unthinkable in my mother's house, where the waitstaff was invisible and the seating chart was a tactical map. She sat down for a moment, her elbows on the table, her eyes searching mine. "Thoughts are dangerous company on a holiday," she said. "I'm Margaret, by the way. My middle name is Eleanor, but I only use it when I'm being particularly stubborn." She winked. "My husband Richard is in the kitchen. He's the one who insists on the rosemary. He says it's the smell of remembrance, though at our age, we're mostly trying to remember where we put the car keys." I laughed. It was a small, rusty sound, but it felt like a triumph. "I'm Eleanor. Just Eleanor." "That's a plenty big enough name to be Eleanor," she replied. Just then, a man emerged from the swinging kitchen doors. He was tall, with shoulders that seemed built for carrying heavy things and a beard the color of wood ash. He was wearing a dark apron stained with gravy, and he was carrying a platter of sliced turkey that looked like a work of art. "Margaret," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Table 4 needs more butter, and I think we're down to the last 2 servings of the cranberry relish." He stopped when he saw me. He didn't look at me with the polite, empty curiosity of a waiter. He looked at me with a quiet, protective steadiness. It was the look I had spent a lifetime searching for in my father's eyes. Look that said, I see you and you are safe here. My heart did that strange, painful stutter again. Logistics. It was the word my mother had used to erase me. Hearing him dismiss it so casually felt like someone had reached into my chest and turned a key. For the next hour, I didn't feel like a ghost. Margaret and Richard fluttered back and forth, but they always stopped by. A plate appeared in front of me, piled high with food that tasted of sunlight and soil. There were roasted root vegetables, stuffing that was crispy on the edges and soft in the middle, and a gravy so rich it felt like a hug. But it wasn't just the food. It was the way they moved around the room. They weren't just serving meals. They were tending a fire. When the elderly man in the suit dropped his fork, Richard was there with a new one before it even hit the floor, leaning in to tell a joke that made the old man's face light up like a bulb. As I finished my wine, I watched Margaret hand a small white box to the young man with the book. "For your breakfast tomorrow," she said, patting his hand. "Studying is hungry work." I felt a lump form in my throat. This wasn't the perfection my mother demanded. The napkins didn't match. The floor creaked. A glass broke in the kitchen, and Richard let out a loud, joyous "Opa!" that made the whole room laugh. It was messy. It was imperfect. It was home. As the crowd began to thin out, Margaret came back to my table with 2 mugs of coffee and a thick slice of apple pie. She sat down, and this time, she didn't look like she was in a hurry to get back up. "So," she said softly, the firelight dancing in her silver hair, "who told you there wasn't a seat for you today?" The question was so direct, so lacking in judgment, that the truth just tumbled out. I told her about the phone call. I told her about Victoria's centerpieces and my father's silence. I told her about the indigo, bruise on my drawing, and the 30 years of trying to be small enough to fit into the gaps they left behind. I expected her to offer platitudes. I expected "they're your family" or "time heals everything." Instead, Margaret leaned across the table, her eyes fierce. "Family isn't a blood contract you sign at birth, Eleanor. It's a choice you make every single day. And if they've stopped choosing you, then they've stopped being your family. They're just people you used to know." She looked over at Richard, who was leaning against the bar, watching us with that same steady, protective gaze. "We lost our only daughter 10 years ago," Margaret said, her voice dropping an octave. "A car accident. The seat at our table has been empty for a long time. We opened this place because we realized that the world is full of people with empty seats, and people who are looking for one." She reached out and covered my hand with hers. Her skin was warm, smelling of cinnamon and soap. "You found your way here for a reason, Eleanor. And I have a feeling this isn't the last time we're going to see you." I looked at her, then at Richard, then at the dying embers in the fireplace. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a guest. I felt like I was standing on solid ground. "Richard?" "This is Eleanor," Margaret said. "She found us just in time." Richard set the platter down on a nearby sideboard and wiped his hand on his apron before offering it to me. His grip was firm, warm, and calloused. "Good to meet you, Eleanor. You like the dark meat or the white?" "Both," I said, surprised by my own appetite. "And everything else, too." "That's the spirit," he grunted, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We don't do logistics here. We do family, even if we have to make it up as we go along." The weeks following Thanksgiving were a blur of cold rain and quiet transformation. I kept waiting for the withdrawal to hit, for the urge to unblock my mother's number or check Victoria's Instagram to see if they were sorry. But the silence from their side of the world felt like a heavy door had finally latched shut. Instead of looking backward, I found my car steering itself toward the brick district. It started with a thank you note. I had spent 3 days illustrating a wreath of rosemary and dried orange slices on a thick card, my hands steadier than they had been in years. When I dropped it off at the hearth, Richard was unloading a crate of winter squash. He saw me, wiped his brow, and pointed a calloused finger at the door. "Margaret's inside. She's been wondering if that coffee went to your head since we haven't seen you." I didn't just leave the note. I stayed for an hour. Then a few days later, I stayed for 3. By mid-December, I had a spot at the end of the bar. I would bring my sketchbook and my pens, the scratch of my nib against the paper, blending with the hiss of the espresso machine and the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of Richard's knife against the cutting board. "You're doing it again," Margaret said one Tuesday afternoon. She was polishing glasses, her movements fluid and practiced. Doing what? I asked, looking up from a detailed study of a frosted pine cone. Shrinking, she said, leaning over the bar. You're sitting on the very edge of that stool, like you're afraid. The wood will complain if you sit back. Take up space, Eleanor. You paid for the coffee, but the air is free. I realized she was right. I was still waiting for someone to tell me I was in the way. It's a hard habit to break, I admitted, finally leaning my back against the chair. Well, break it here, she said firmly, because Richard and I have been talking. The walls in here are a bit bare, and your little drawings, as you call them, are the most beautiful things I've seen since the sun rose over the Amalfi Coast in '92. She wanted to hang my work, not as a favor but as a feature. Over the next 2 weeks, the integration happened slowly, then all at once. I helped Margaret decorate the bistro for Christmas, not with the sterile, white and silver perfection of my mother's house, but with boughs of real cedar that made the air smell like a forest, and mismatched vintage ornaments that held stories in their chipped paint. Richard taught me how to make a proper roux. Stir it like you mean it, Elle, he'd say, standing over my shoulder. If you're timid with the flour, the sauce will know. Food can smell fear. One night, after the last customer had drifted out into the snow, the three of us sat at the large round table in the center of the room. Richard had opened a bottle of expensive red, the good stuff. He kept for milestones. It has a lot of love left over, and it seems a waste to let it go cold. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. He slid it across the wooden table toward me. It was a key, not a shiny new one, but an old brass skeleton key with a frayed red ribbon tied through the loop. That's for the back door, Richard said, in case you ever need to get in out of the rain, or in case you just want to paint when the light is good in the morning. I picked up the key. It was cold, but it felt like it was humming in my palm. I thought about the house I grew up in, the house where I'd lived for 18 years and never had a key of my own, because my mother didn't want me coming and going like it's a hotel. I looked at Margaret, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears, and at Richard, who was looking at me with a fierce, quiet pride. I don't know what to say, I whispered. Don't say anything, Margaret said, reaching over to tuck a stray hair behind my ear. Just know that from now on, there is always, always a seat for you here. That night, I didn't go straight home. I went to the back door of the bistro. I fit the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying solid click. I stepped inside the dark restaurant, the smell of wood smoke and spices wrapping around me like a blanket. I sat in the dark for a long time, the key clutched in my hand. I realized that the shattering my mother had caused wasn't the end of my life. It was the breaking of a shell, and for the first time, I could feel the warmth of the sun. But as I began to heal, I didn't realize that the universe was about to send someone else to the table, someone who would teach me that. Being chosen wasn't just about family, but about the kind of love that sees your scars and calls them beautiful. I had a dream about our Sarah last night, Margaret said softly, her hand finding Richard's on the table. She was laughing, and she was wearing a scarf exactly the color of that green coat of yours. Eleanor. The air in the room shifted. It wasn't heavy with grief, but light with a strange, shimmering warmth. We know we aren't your parents, Richard said, his voice gravelly and low. And we know we can't erase the people who we're supposed to be. But this place, the universe has a funny way of balancing the scales. For every door that slams shut with a hollow bang, it seems to crack a window in a room you didn't even know existed. His name was Andrew. He didn't arrive with a thunderclap. He arrived with a broken radiator and a look of profound, rain-drenched confusion. It was a Tuesday in early January, the kind of day where the sky looks like a wet wool blanket and the wind bites through your layers, like a serrated knife. I was sitting at my usual spot at the end of the bar, working on a series of winter botanicals for the bistro's new seasonal menus. I was sketching a branch of witch hazel, stubborn, spindly yellow blooms that thrive in the dead of winter, when the bell over the door chimed with a frantic rattle. Andrew stepped in, a gust of sleet following him. He was tall, with glasses that were immediately fogged over and a leather messenger bag that looked like it had seen better decades. I'm so sorry, he panted, wiping his lenses with a damp handkerchief. My car just gave up the ghost 3 blocks away. My phone is at 1%, and I think I might be developing mild hypothermia. Please tell me you have something hot and caffeinated. Richard, who was wiping down the espresso machine, let out a low chuckle. Son, you look like you were dragged behind a boat. Sit down before you fall down. Andrew sank into the stool next to mine. He didn't see me at first, too busy trying to coax his phone back to life. When Richard set a steaming mug of black coffee in front of him, Andrew took a sip and let out a sound that was half sigh, half prayer. "You're a saint," Andrew said. "Don't tell my wife," Richard grunted, nodding toward the kitchen. "She's the only saint allowed in this building." That was when Andrew turned and saw my sketchbook. He froze, his mug halfway to his lips. I expected the usual polite, "That's nice," or the awkward, "Are you an artist?" Instead, he leaned in, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. "The Hamamelis virginiana," he whispered. "You captured the curl of the petals perfectly. Most people draw them too straight, like sunbeams. But they're messy. They're frantic. That's why they survive the frost." I blinked. "You know witch hazel?" "I'm a landscape architect," he said, finally offering a lopsided, slightly shy smile. "I spend a lot of time thinking about things that grow when they shouldn't." "I'm Andrew." "Eleanor," I said. For the next 2 hours, the rain outside didn't matter. Andrew didn't just talk at me. He talked with me. He noticed the way I layered the ink to create depth. He told me about a garden he was designing that used only native plants, things that were hardy enough to handle a storm. Over the next month, Andrew became a fixture. He started showing up on Tuesdays, then Thursdays, then just because I was in the neighborhood. He would sit next to me, his laptop open with blueprints, while I worked on my illustrations. "Just thinking," I said, my breath hitching, "about how lucky this all feels, and how luck usually runs out." Andrew stopped under the glow of a street lamp. He didn't reach for me right away. He just looked at me with a terrifying kind of honesty. "It's not luck, Eleanor," he said softly. "I choose to come here. Every day. I choose to sit on a cramped stool and drink too much coffee just to hear you talk about the way the light hits a leaf. That's not a roll of the dice. That's a decision." He reached out then, his hand warm against my cold cheek. "I know you've spent a long time being the person people forgot to invite. But I'm inviting you into everything. For as long as you'll have me." I leaned into his touch, the scent of cedar and rain clinging to his coat. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was auditioning for a part in my own life. I was the lead. But as my relationship with Andrew deepened, and as Margaret and Richard began to treat me more like a daughter than a regular, the legal reality of my situation started to weigh on me. I wanted something permanent. I wanted a name that didn't feel like a borrowed suit. I wanted to belong to them, not just in spirit, but on paper. I wanted the world to know that the girl who wasn't given a seat had finally found her home. No frantic drama. It was the way he would quietly move my water jar so I wouldn't knock it over. It was the way he'd bring me a specific type of charcoal pencil he'd found at a specialty shop. It was the way he looked at me, not as a logistics issue or an extra person, but as the main event. One evening after we'd closed the bistro and Margaret was teaching, Andrew had to properly fold the heavy linen napkins. I felt a familiar pang of fear. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was waiting for him to realize I was too sensitive or too much baggage. "You're quiet tonight," Andrew said, stepping outside with me into the crisp night air. It was a slow, steady burn. There were no grand gestures. The idea took root on a Tuesday in March, a day when the light was finally beginning to change, shifting from the bruised purple of winter to a pale, hopeful gold. I was in the back office of the bistro, helping Margaret organize the invoices, when I saw a photograph tucked into the corner of her desk. It was Sarah, their daughter, smiling in front of a fountain. She had the same determined set to her jaw that Margaret had. "I wish I'd known her," I whispered. Margaret looked up, her eyes softening. "In a way, Eleanor, I think you do. You have her heart. You have that same way of looking at a broken thing and seeing how to fix it." I took a deep breath. My heart was thumping against my ribs. "Margaret, I've been thinking about names, about families, about the fact that, legally, I'm still tied to people who don't want me, and I'm untied to the people who do." Margaret stilled. She put down her pen and looked at me, her entire focus narrowing until it was just the two of us in the small, paper-scented room. "Go on," she said softly. "I want to be an Eleanor," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "Not just because it's my name, but because it's yours. I want to be your Eleanor. I want to know that if I'm in the hospital, you're the ones they call. I want to know that when I marry Andrew, it's Richard who walks me down the aisle, not because he's filling a gap, but because he's my father." The silence that followed was thick and heavy, but it didn't feel cold. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, a single drop tracing a path through the flour dust on her cheek. She didn't say anything. She just stood up and pulled me into an embrace that smelled of yeast and lavender and absolute unwavering safety. We thought about asking, she choked out into my hair, but we didn't want you to feel like we were trying to replace what you lost. We didn't want to overstep. You aren't replacing anything, I said, clinging to her. You're building something where there was only a hole. Adult adoption is a strange, beautiful process. It's a legal declaration that love isn't just a feeling. It's a commitment that the state acknowledges. As the paperwork began to move through the system, Andrew and I began to plan our wedding. We didn't want a ballroom or a professional film crew. We wanted the hearth. We planned for June. We wanted the windows open, the smell of jasmine drifting in from the alley, and a table so long it took up the entire center of the restaurant. One table, I told Andrew as we looked at the floor plan. No tiers. No important side. Just one long table where everyone is equal. Andrew squeezed my hand. And plenty of seats. Eleanor, it read. We heard through the grapevine that you are getting married, and that you are doing something peculiar regarding your legal status. I don't know what kind of game you are playing, but your father is very distressed. We will be in the city on the 14th. We expect to be at the ceremony. It's time to stop this childishness and come back to your senses. Family is family, regardless of your little tantrums. My stomach turned. There it was. The weaponized guilt. The dismissal of my pain as a tantrum. The demand for a seat they had never earned. I looked at the letter, and then I looked at the small framed photo on my mantel. It was a picture Richard had taken of Margaret and me laughing over a burnt batch of cookies. In that photo, I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't hiding. I was blooming. The fear was there, yes. The old childhood fear of my mother's cold eyes and my sister's sharp tongue. But beneath the fear was something new. Something forged in the heat of Richard's kitchen and tempered by Andrew's steady love. They think they can just walk in, I whispered to the empty room. They think the door is still open. I walked over to my desk and picked up my pen. I didn't write back. I didn't give them an opening. Instead, I called the one person I knew would understand the weight of a boundary. Richard? I said when he picked up. They know. And they're coming. Let them come. Richard's voice came through the line, steady as a heartbeat. The locks have been changed for a long time, Elle. And this time, you aren't the one standing outside in the rain. I hung up the phone, the brass key to the bistro feeling heavy and warm in my pocket. I knew the confrontation was coming. I knew they wouldn't let me go without a fight. But for the first time in my 31 years, I wasn't afraid of the logistics. I was ready to defend the home I had built, but as the date approached, a low thrumming anxiety began to vibrate in my chest. I had been free for over a year, but the ghost of my biological family still haunted the edges of my joy. I had sent them nothing. No updates, no photos, no olive branches. I had stayed blocked. Then 3 weeks before the wedding, I received a letter. It wasn't an email or a text. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope with my mother's unmistakable, sharp handwriting. It had been sent to my studio address, the one place I hadn't changed. I sat on the floor of my apartment, the sunlight hitting the floorboards in bright, unforgiving squares. I opened it with trembling hands. The morning of the wedding, the air smelled of rain-washed peonies and the yeast of rising bread. I stood in the small dressing room upstairs at the hearth, staring at my reflection. I wasn't wearing the heavy, beaded satin my mother had once picked out for Victoria. I was wearing a simple, flowing silk the color of a tea rose, with delicate embroidery of witch hazel along the hem, Andrew's favorite. Margaret stood behind me, her hands steady as she tucked a single sprig of rosemary into my hair. "You look like yourself, Eleanor," she whispered, her eyes bright in the mirror. "Not a version of someone else. Just you." The ceremony was held in the center of the bistro, surrounded by the smell of old wood and new flowers. When the music started, a soft, acoustic cello, I felt a hand on mine. Richard stood there in a charcoal suit, looking uncomfortable but fiercely proud. "Ready, daughter?" he asked. "Ready," I said. We walked down the narrow aisle created by the long communal table. Andrew was waiting at the end, his eyes fixed on mine with such intensity that the rest of the room faded to a blur. But as we reached the altar, the space in front of the fireplace, the heavy front door of the bistro creaked open. The cello music faltered. I didn't have to look to know who it was. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My mother, Diane, stepped inside first, her chin tilted at that familiar regal angle. Behind her was Victoria, looking around the bistro with a faint, tight-lipped expression of pity, and my father, James, who looked like he wanted to dissolve into the brickwork. The guests, our real family, the regulars, the friends who had actually shown up for my life, went silent. Eleanor, my mother's voice rang out sharp and clear. We're late. The traffic was abominable. But it seems you've already started this. Little gathering without us. She began to walk toward the front, her heels clicking aggressively against the wooden floor. She looked at the long table, her lip curling. And where are our seats? Surely you didn't expect the parents of the bride to stand in the back like the help? I felt Richard's arm stiffen beside me. I felt Andrew start to step forward, his protective instinct flaring. But I put my hand up. I stepped out from behind the flowers. I didn't shrink. I didn't look at the floor. I looked Diane straight in the eyes. There isn't a seat, I said. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. My mother froze, her face turning a mottled, angry red. I beg your pardon? I'm using your logistics, Mom, I said, my voice calm and even. The table is full. We're at capacity. I'm sure you understand. This is ridiculous, Victoria huffed, crossing her arms. Eleanor, stop being so sensitive. It's a wedding. You can't just turn your family away because of some petty grudge about Thanksgiving. Fine, Diane spat, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and genuine shock. If this is how you want to live amongst these people, then don't expect another word from us. You are dead to this family, Eleanor. No, Mom, I said as they turned toward the door. I'm finally alive. You just don't recognize the person I've become because you never bothered to look at the person I was. The door slammed shut behind them. For a second, the room felt hollowed out by the force of their exit. Then, Margaret walked over to the old record player in the corner and dropped the needle. A warm, soulful jazz track filled the air. Andrew reached for my hands. They were shaking, but only a little. He pulled me close, his forehead resting against mine. You okay? He whispered. I'm free, I said. We finished the ceremony, in front of 50 people who cheered, until the rafters shook. We ate at the long table, passing platters of roasted chicken and bowls of sage stuffing. There were no logistics issues, there was just enough. Enough food, enough wine, and more than enough love. As the sun set and the candles flickered low, I realized that the confrontation hadn't been about winning. It had been about drawing a line in the dirt and saying, this far and no further. I had finally closed the door on the people who shared my DNA, but I had opened the window to the people who shared my soul. Eleanor, enough of this theater, Diane snapped, reaching out to grab my arm. We are your blood. We are your family. You are coming home after this, and we will settle this nonsense. Before she could touch me, Richard stepped in. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He stood like an ancient oak, immovable and massive. She is home, Richard said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the floorboards. And you are trespassing. Who do you think you are? My mother hissed. I'm the man who's adopting her, Richard said. I'm the man who's walking her down the aisle. I'm her father. And I'm asking you to leave my restaurant. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother looked at me, then at Margaret, who was standing by the bar with her arms folded, her expression as hard as flint. Diane looked for a weakness, a crack in the armor she'd spent decades creating. She found nothing. I looked at my father. He was looking at his shoes, his shoulders slumped. Dad, I said, you had 1,000 chances to pull out a chair for me. You stayed silent every single time. Your silence was a choice. And today, I'm making mine. It wasn't about the dinner. Victoria, I said, turning to her. It was about the fact that for 30 years, I was the only one expected to sacrifice. I was the one who didn't matter. But in this room, on this day, I am the only one who matters. The weeks following, the wedding felt like the first deep breath after a lifetime of underwater swimming. The world was quieter, but it was a vibrant, meaningful quiet. There were no more midnight panic attacks about missed calls. No more rehearsing explanations for why I wasn't enough. The legal adoption went through on a rainy Tuesday in July. Standing in that wood-paneled courtroom, watching a judge sign the papers that officially made me Eleanor Miller, taking Margaret and Richard's name, felt more sacred than any religious rite. When the judge handed me the document, Richard didn't shake my hand. He hugged me so hard my ribs crunched, and Margaret cried openly, her tears dampening the collar of my blazer. Official, she whispered. Permanently ours. I spent the rest of the summer in a state of creative fever. My studio was no longer a place of solitude. It was a place of power. I began a new series of large-scale oil paintings, not just of plants, but of the people who tended them. I painted Richard's hands, flour-dusted and scarred. I painted Margaret's eyes, fierce and kind. I painted Andrew's back as he worked over his blueprints. One afternoon, a courier arrived at the bistro with a small, heavy box. There was no card, only a return address I recognized as my father's office. Inside was a tattered, stuffed rabbit with one eye missing, a toy I had lost when I was 5. Beneath it was a short, handwritten note on a yellow legal pad. I found this in the attic while your mother was out. I'm sorry I didn't find it sooner. I'm sorry for everything I didn't find. You looked beautiful in that rose silk. I wish I had said it then. I sat at the bar staring at the rabbit. A year ago, this would have broken me. I would have searched for hidden meaning, for a sign of a bridge being built. But now I just felt a quiet, distant pity. He was still hiding. He was still sending toys instead of standing up. Do you want to keep it? Andrew asked, leaning over my shoulder. I looked at the toy, then out the window, at the garden Andrew and I were planting in the bistro's back alley, a riot of foxgloves and climbing roses. No, I said softly. I think it belongs in the past. I donated the rabbit to a local shelter and didn't reply. Closure isn't always a long conversation or a tearful apology. Sometimes closure is simply realizing you no longer have a use for the things that used to hurt you. As autumn began to turn the leaves to burnt copper and gold, a new kind of change took root. It started with a morning of sudden, overwhelming nausea while I was sketching a branch of crabapples. Then came the exhaustion, a heavy, bone-deep tiredness that no amount of coffee could fix. I knew before the test even turned blue. I told Andrew in the middle of our garden. He cried, his face buried in the crook of my neck, his hands cradling my waist as if I were made of the finest porcelain. No, I laughed, reaching out to take Margaret's hand. We're going to need another chair. A small one. In about 7 months. The silence lasted for exactly 3 seconds. Then Richard let out a roar of joy that I'm certain they heard 3 blocks away. He scooped me up, spinning me around while Margaret hovered nearby, her face radiant, her hands already reaching out to touch my stomach, as if she could feel the heartbeat through the fabric of my sweater. A grandchild, Margaret breathed, her voice trembling. Oh, Eleanor. A news story. That night, as the first frost of the season began to lace the windows with silver, I sat in the darkened bistro alone for a moment. I thought about the girl who had been told there wasn't a seat. I thought about the indigo ink ruin and the cold, lonely Thanksgiving. I touched my belly. My child would never know that feeling. They would grow up in a world where the table was always long enough, where the bread was always warm, and where they were chosen every single day. My biological family had given me my DNA, but Margaret and Richard had given me my life. And Andrew was giving me a future. I walked to the front door and turned the sign to closed. But as I looked at the hearth glowing in the dark, I knew that for me, the doors would never truly be shut again. But telling Margaret and Richard was the moment that felt like the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. We sat them down at our table after the dinner rush. The bistro was dim, lit only by the flickering orange light of the hearth. We have a new logistics issue, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Richard looked up from a ledger, his brow furrowing. The walk-in fridge acting up again? The air in the bistro was thick with the scent of roasted pears and cinnamon, the quintessential smell of a Sunday afternoon in late spring. I sat by the window, the sunlight warming my skin, watching a toddler with a shock of dark hair, my son, Leo, stumble toward Richard. Richard, whose hair was now entirely the color of moonlight, let out a deep, rumbling laugh as he scooped the boy up and perched him on his broad shoulder. See that, Leo? Richard pointed toward the kitchen where Margaret was humming a soft tune. That's where the magic happens. And don't let anyone tell you it's just flour and water. I watched them, my heart full to the point of aching. It has been 5 years since the phone call that shattered my world, and 4 years since I officially became a miller. Sometimes when I'm sketching in the quiet hours of the morning, I still have to stop and remind myself that this is real. The house isn't on fire. The floor isn't going to drop out from under me. I am allowed to be happy. Andrew walked over, leaning down to press a kiss to the top of my head before setting a fresh cup of tea on the table. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. We have reached that beautiful, quiet stage of love where the silence is as communicative as a conversation. I looked down at the table. It was the same long wooden communal table from our wedding. It was scarred now, marked with the rings of coffee mugs and the faint indentations of years of shared meals. To anyone else, it was just furniture. To me, it was an altar. I realized then that healing isn't about forgetting the pain. I still remember the coldness of my mother's voice. I still remember the hollow feeling of being the extra person. But those memories no longer have teeth. They are like old photographs in a drawer, flat, distant, and powerless to hurt the woman I am today. I've learned that the greatest act of rebellion against a family that doesn't want you is to build a life that is beautiful without them. To be soft when they were hard. To be present when they were absent. To pull out a chair for every person who looks like they've spent too long standing in the rain. I stood up and walked over to the wall where my newest series of illustrations hung. They weren't just botanicals anymore. They were stories. In the center was a painting of a witch hazel branch, its yellow petals bright against a backdrop of snow. Beneath it, I had etched a single line. To bloom in the winter is not a tragedy. It is a triumph. I am Eleanor Miller. I am a wife, a mother, an artist, and a daughter, not by blood, but by 1,000 small daily choices. I was the girl who wasn't given a seat, so I went out and built my own table. And there is always, always room for one more. If you're watching this and you've been the scapegoat of your family, if you've been told you're too much or too sensitive, or always causing drama just because you dared to ask to be treated fairly, I want you to know something. It's not you. It never was. You deserve to be chosen. Not as a backup, not as a last resort, not as the acceptable sacrifice when someone else's comfort is at stake. Chosen first. Chosen fully. Chosen without conditions. Family isn't blood. Family isn't obligation. Family isn't people who share your DNA but treat you like a burden. Family is the people who show up. The people who see you crying alone and invite you to their table. The people who open their hearts and their homes and make you officially, permanently, undeniably theirs. I spent 30 years trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. And then I spent 5 years learning what love actually looks like. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It helps more people find these stories when they need them most. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set boundaries with your own family? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far this story reaches. And if you want more stories like this, check the description. I've linked some of my favorites there. Until next time, remember, you deserve to be chosen.